why is Donald Trump is still refraining sanctions against Russia? Is there something bigger rather than just a sympathy to Putin?
Well, I wouldn't pretend to know what's in Donald Trump's mind. I'm not sure whether Donald Trump himself knows what's in Donald Trump's mind. He's a mystery to even people who work around him. But there are several factors to think about. It's possible that the Russians have something on him which is embarrassing, and he feels in some way beholden, either because of business links with his family in the past or something else. We just don't know. I don't know. But it's also possible that he just admires strength and dictators because he's been very positive about Bolsonaro, Erdogan in Turkey. He even talks about President Xi with quite a lot of admiration. So it may simply be a case that he admires the strength and the autocracy. But it is also, I think, because inside the White House there is a feeling that they have to split Russia away from China in order to combat China. And there's also a feeling that if they can forge an alliance with Russia, there could be a lot of economic possibilities in the future. So the White House is thinking a lot about Russia, and it has been thinking less about Ukraine. However, I think that's changing. So around Donald Trump, there are very mixed messages about Russia and Ukraine. Some people on the MAGA side really are quite pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian, but there are many others who are actually very, very strongly pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian. So I think at the moment, Trump is flipping back and forth, depending on who he last spoke to.
Yeah, and speaking about sanctions, you know, I was thinking yesterday and discussing that with my colleagues. Could sanctions somehow simply expand the lower class in Russia, but at the same time, the middle class will shrink, so people with a lack of money, because of the lack of money, will choose to go to the war?
Well, there's two types of sanctions. There's sanctions that are targeted against individuals and individual oligarchs, and that has been used quite a lot. I personally think that in some cases, the indiscriminate use has been a mistake, because I actually think it's a pity that we didn't try to turn some of the oligarchs early on by essentially offering them incentives to turn against Putin and to basically be free of sanctions or to come to the West. The fact that sanctions were imposed on all the oligarchs meant they all went and circled around Putin. But the second type of sanctions are the sanctions against ordinary Russians or against Russian businesses. And there is certainly a danger that that's going to be used by Putin as an excuse for the economic problems in Russia, because Russia today does have significant and growing economic problems. They are very much linked to the war and the mismanagement of the economy, but it's very convenient for Putin to blame that on sanctions by the West and to try and create more nationalist opposition towards the West.
Yes,
and that's a danger.
They will be more united then.
Well, that's a danger. And we just don't know how that's going to play out. I can't pretend to understand what the sentiment really is inside Russia today. But one of the things that Western analysts miscalculated back in 2022 was they thought that if they imposed sanctions on the Russian economy, ordinary Russians would get very angry with Putin and basically start campaigning for change. And in fact, the Western analysts underestimated just how cleverly Putin and the government managed to create this mood of nationalism and support for Russian nationalism and for Putin and for the war very quickly. And so the country has actually rallied around him in this war in a way that's horrific, and I think the West did not expect.
Mm-hmm. Speaking about the question that worry me and worry all the Ukraine is investments also. And Ukraine is desperately seeking for investments. Do you see an interest in private American capital, a desire to invest in Ukraine?
Well, there's 2 or 3 areas of interest right now, or people who are interested. There are people who have Ukrainian heritage and who have a very strong emotional connection with Ukraine and want to help. And sometimes they are engaged in what's called concessionary capital, which is essentially doing partly philanthropy and partly investment. Mm-hmm. So there's that group. There's not a lot of them, but there's that group. There's a second group who are very involved in defense tech, and they are extremely interested in Ukraine because of how it's pioneering a new type of warfare that they think will be a big business in the future in other parts of the world. So they're also investing. And then there's a third category of people who at some point hope that Ukraine will be reconstructing itself and there will be big business opportunities which are more traditional and normal in things like infrastructure and other areas of life, consumer goods. That third group at the moment are not very involved because they think it's too early, because the country is too unstable. The military tech group investors are definitely getting involved, and that's exploding. And the philanthropic investors who want to support Ukraine because they care about Ukraine, they've been here for some time, but to a certain degree they invested a lot at the beginning and some of their energy is beginning to decline. But that could easily return again if they start to feel that there's real progress being made in the war.
Yeah, so Gillian, before joining the Financial Times in 1993, you earned a PhD in social anthropology in Cambridge University. And based on your fieldwork in the former Soviet Union in the early 90s, you saw Russia from the inside. Now you see a lot of Ukraine from the inside. What does that previous experience, from the experience in Ukraine you have now, about our difference, that we are not that brotherly nations that everybody's talking about?
Well, as an anthropologist, I'm very interested in culture. And people sometimes think that culture is something which is fixed and static and sealed, a bit like a plastic Tupperware box, and that you basically have Russian culture and Ukrainian culture or British culture. And culture doesn't work like that. It's more like a river, which is constantly changing slowly with new streams coming in and the banks are muddy. So anything I say about Russian and Ukrainian cultural zeitgeist has to be seen in that context. So firstly, I'm quite ignorant. And secondly, the cultures are never just one thing. They're always changing and they're complicated. But having said that, the point I want to communicate very strongly is this. When I was studying in Moscow in the late 1980s, I had Russian and Ukrainian friends and Belarusian friends as well. And I kind of thought they were basically all the same because they seemed to operate and think in a similar kind of way. Now, that was a very small group, but I knew there was difference of history, but I thought they were very roughly the same. And I went to Kiev and it all seemed roughly the same Soviet culture. But what's happened since 1991 is that the differences which were always there to some degree because of history between the Russian nation and the Ukrainian nation, I think have become more and more important. And culturally, they've become more and more separated in their paths. And the critical difference, in my view, is that in Russia, the vision of power and politics is very hierarchical. And people look up to a leader for orders, and information goes up and orders come down. And many Russians feel quite passive and quite helpless in terms of their ability to change the world or get engaged in politics or make a difference. And Ukraine, partly because of its history, has a much stronger sense of what we call agency, or a belief that they have the right to try and change their environment and change themselves and improve the world. And instead of having a hierarchical model of power, a vertical model of power, there's a much stronger sense of a horizontal model of power, where Ukrainians have long been very good at organizing themselves in self-organized groups, lateral patterns of organization, and constantly challenging and questioning authority. It's a very rebellious nation, ever since the Cossacks. And of course, there are big differences in Ukraine, and these are stereotypes. But I think what's happened since 2014, or really before that, is two things that are very important. One is that events like Maidan showed people that people power in Ukraine is important, and young people can organize themselves, and older people, and try to push for change. and have a sense of agency. But also, the explosion of the internet and the digital businesses reinforce that for two reasons. Firstly, that the internet is organized on lateral networks. The internet is a world where you are automatically trained to think about horizontal networks of power, not authoritarian hierarchical networks. And secondly, when the internet hit Russia and Ukraine, Russia's market is so big that many of the engineers worked for Russian companies in the world of digital back offices and computing. In Ukraine, it wasn't big enough. So many Ukrainian internet engineers and software engineers worked for Western companies, and they became plugged into these Western networks and exposed to Western liberal ideas like agency and self-help and democracy and a belief that you have the right to have a voice and change the world. So today, it seems to me, as an outsider, and again, it's just my impressions and I'm quite ignorant, but it seems to me that Ukraine has this incredible spirit of agency. And the war has intensified that dramatically. And it means that it's chaotic and messy and rebellious, and it's a nightmare to try and manage, but it's also creative and vibrant and entrepreneurial and democratic and resilient. And I actually think that today, that is Ukraine's superpower.